In 1881, the most famous engineer on Earth looked at 50 miles of jungle and promised to cut it in half. He had already done the impossible once. He had joined the Mediterranean to the Red Sea at Suez, a flat trench through open desert, and the whole world had called it a miracle. So when Ferdinand de Lesseps said he would slice through Panama and marry the Atlantic to the Pacific, nobody bet against him. They should have. Because over the next 8 years, that jungle would swallow 22,000 human lives. It would bankrupt one of the richest nations in Europe. It would take the most celebrated builder of the century and break him in front of the entire world. And then, 25 years later, a different country walked into the exact same jungle and won. Not with a smarter man, not with more money. With a machine. One 95-ton machine, and a single idea that de Lesseps never understood. This is the story of how America dug the Panama Canal, and of the iron monster that finally beat the jungle that had killed everyone before it. It began with a man who thought it would be easy. Ferdinand de Lesseps was not an engineer. That is the first thing you need to know. He was a promoter, a salesman, a diplomat with a golden tongue, and after Suez he was treated like a living god. When he told France that Panama would be Suez all over again, France emptied its pockets. Hundreds of thousands of ordinary people bought shares. Widows put in their savings. It was a national project, a point of pride, and de Lesseps made one fatal decision before a single shovel touched the ground. He insisted on a sea-level canal, a straight, flat cut all the way across, ocean to ocean, exactly like Suez. No locks, no stairs, just a ditch through a continent. At Suez that worked, because Suez was flat, dry desert. Panama was neither. Panama had a spine of solid rock running down its middle, the Continental Divide, rising hundreds of feet into the clouds. And Panama had the Chagres, a river that could rise 10 feet in a single night and turn a construction site into a lake. De Lesseps looked at all of it and waved it away. The great man did not do stairs. The digging began in 1881, and almost immediately, the jungle started counting bodies. Nobody in 1881 knew what caused malaria or yellow fever. They thought it came from bad air, from the swamp, from the smell. So the hospitals the French built, beautiful, modern hospitals, put the legs of every bed in little dishes of water to keep the ants away from the sick. Those dishes of standing water were perfect breeding pools for the exact mosquito that carried yellow fever. The French had, without knowing it, built mosquito farms inside their own hospitals. A man would come in with a broken arm and leave in a coffin. The death toll is almost impossible to hold in your head. Over the life of the French effort, an estimated 22,000 workers died. Whole crews were wiped out and replaced. Wiped out and replaced. New engineers arriving from France were told, quietly, to write their wills on the boat. And the men who survived the disease still had to fight the mud. This is the part de Lesseps never understood, and it is the key to the whole story, so hold on to it. The problem in Panama was never really the digging. Anyone can dig a hole. The problem was what you did with the dirt after you dug it, because every time it rained, the walls of the cut slid back down into the hole you had just made. The French would excavate for a month, and a single mudslide would erase the work in an afternoon. They were trying to dig a trench through wet sugar. Their machines made it worse. The French excavators were small. Light little bucket dredges and rail shovels built for tidy European canals, not for a mountain of rock and clay. They were toys against a continent. By 1889 it was over. The company had spun through more than 1 billion francs and had not finished even half the job. It collapsed in the largest financial scandal France had ever seen. They called it the Panama Affair, and it took the savings of 800,000 people down with it. Ministers were charged with corruption. De Lesseps, the god of Suez, was convicted in a French court and died. A broken, disgraced old man. The jungle had won, the greatest builder alive was dead, and the canal was a rusting graveyard of abandoned French machines, slowly being eaten by the vines. For 15 years, that is how it stayed. Then, in 1904, the United States bought what was left. The rights, the ruins, the rusting shovels, and it announced that it would finish the job. Most of the world quietly expected the Americans to die there too. The first American chief engineer took one look at the disease and the chaos and quit within a year. But the second man they sent changed everything, and this is the detail that mattered. He was not a canal expert, he was a railroad man. His name was John Frank Stevens, and he had built railroads across the American West, through mountains and blizzards. Stevens arrived in Panama, and while everyone around him panicked about how to dig faster, he stood at the edge of the Great Cut and saw the thing de Lesseps had died never seeing. "You are not fighting a digging problem," Stevens said. "You are fighting a hauling problem." The dirt was the enemy. 200 million cubic yards of it. If you could not carry it away faster than the rain slid it back, you would lose. Forever. Exactly like the French. So before Stevens dug a single new yard, he stopped almost all excavation. For months, the politicians in Washington nearly lost their minds, and Stevens spent those months building not a canal, but a railroad. The most sophisticated dirt-moving machine the world had ever seen. A double-tracked, constantly moving conveyor belt of trains, hundreds of them, engineered to run right up to the digging face, take a mountain's worth of spoil, and haul it miles away to build a dam. Tracks that could be lifted and shifted sideways by special machines as the cut got deeper. An entire logistics organism laid down before the real war began. And now the jungle was about to meet the machine that Stevens had built his whole railroad to feed. The Bucyrus 95-ton steam shovel. Understand the scale of this thing. The French shovels had scratched at the earth. The Bucyrus was a land-bound battleship. 95 tons of American steel, a boiler roaring at its heart, an arm that swung a bucket big enough to swallow 5 tons of rock and clay in a single bite. Set one against a cliff of Panama rock and it would tear the mountain apart 8 cubic yards at a time, pivot, and drop that bite straight into Stevens' waiting railroad cars. The United States shipped them in by the hundred. At the peak, more than 100 of these steam shovels worked the line at once, a row of iron monsters chewing through the Continental Divide, breathing coal, smoke, never stopping. One Bucyrus shovel in a single day could move more earth than an entire French crew had moved in a month. The heart of the fight was a place called the Culebra Cut, later renamed the Gaillard Cut, the 9-mile slice driven straight through the mountainous backbone of Panama. This was where the French dream had died, and this was where the steam shovels earned their legend. Layer by layer, they cut the mountain down in giant steps, a spiral of terraces crawling with shovels and trains, dynamite crews blasting the rock loose ahead of them. Millions of pounds of dynamite, more explosives than had been used in every American war combined up to that point. And still, the mountain fought back. The landslides that had beaten the French came for the Americans, too. Whole hillsides would let go and bury tracks and shovels under a wave of mud, sometimes overnight. But this time there was a difference. When the slide buried the cut, the railroad simply brought 100 more shovels and hauled it out again, faster than the mountain could push it back in. For the first time in history, the machine was moving dirt faster than the rain could move it back. Meanwhile, the other enemy, the one that had actually killed the 22,000, was being beaten by a doctor who finally knew the truth. Dr. William Gorgas knew what the French had not. The mosquito, not the air, carried yellow fever and malaria, so Gorgas went to war on the mosquito itself. His men drained the swamps, poured oil on standing water to smother the larvae, screened every window, and fumigated entire towns. It was a military campaign against an insect, and it worked. Within 2 years, yellow fever was gone from Panama. The graveyard the French had built became a place where a man could actually survive long enough to finish his work. Machine against mountain. Doctor against mosquito. For the first time, both fights were being won at once. But cutting through the mountain was only half the canal. And here, America finally admitted the thing de Lesseps had been too proud to accept. You could not build it flat. The land was too high. So the Americans did the one thing the great man had refused to do. They built stairs. Instead of dragging ships down to sea level, they would lift them up and over the mountains on a staircase of water. Giant chambers called locks that fill and drain to raise a ship 85 feet into the air, float it across the top of the continent, and lower it gently down the other side. To make the lake those ships would sail across, engineers threw a dam across the wild Chagres River, the same river that had tormented the French. The Gatun Dam was, at the time, the largest earthen dam ever built by human beings, and the lake behind it was the largest man-made lake on Earth. And what did they build that dam out of? The spoil. The exact dirt the steam shovels were tearing out of the mountain, carried away on Stevens Railroad and packed into a wall to tame a river. Nothing was wasted. The mountain they carved out became the dam that held the river back. Then came the locks themselves. Walls of concrete so massive they are still in service today. More than a century later, they were poured by yet another iteration of purpose-built machines, giant cranes running on overhead cableways, dropping concrete by the bucketful into forms the size of cathedrals. The lock gates alone stood 7 stories tall, and yet they were so perfectly balanced that a motor smaller than the one in a modern car could swing them open. By 1913, the impossible was nearly done. The last of the engineers, an army colonel named George Washington Goethals, had driven the final push. And on the 10th of October, 1913, the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, sat in the White House in Washington and pressed a single telegraph key. That signal ran 2,000 miles down the wire, into the last dike of earth standing between the two halves of the canal, and detonated the charge that blew it apart. The Atlantic and the Pacific, two oceans that had been separated since the beginning of the world, flowed into each other. On the 15th of August, 1914, a ship called the Ancon steamed from one ocean to the other, riding the staircase of water up over a mountain range and down the far side. A journey around the tip of South America that had once taken 2 months and 8,000 miles was now a quiet, 8-hour cruise. The jungle that had killed 22,000 men and destroyed the most celebrated builder of the age had finally been beaten. Not by a smarter man than de Lesseps, by a humbler idea and a bigger machine. A railroad man who understood that the dirt was the enemy, a doctor who understood the mosquito, and 195-ton steam shovels that ate a mountain and used it to dam an ocean. De Lesseps tried to conquer Panama with his own genius, and it killed him. America conquered it by refusing to be too proud to build stairs, and by bringing a machine so big that the mountains simply ran out of ways to say no. The steam shovels are gone now. Most were scrapped. A few still rust quietly in the Panamanian jungle where they were left behind. But the thing they built still runs, every single day. Right now, as you watch this, a ship is climbing that staircase of water, floating over the graves of the men who died, believing it could never be done. If you want to see the other impossible things that were built by machines the world forgot, subscribe. Because the next one is even bigger. And if your family ever worked construction or ran heavy iron, tell me about the biggest machine you ever stood next to down in the comments. I read every one. Thanks for watching. I'll see you at the next impossible build.